Hi, today I want to teach about leadership through an evolutionary lens. And we're going to discuss whether or not there is that evolutionary component to leadership itself. Let's begin by thinking about an interesting demonstration of how leadership can unfold in present day times and see if we can apply that back to the ancestral times. Consider ABC's Survivor series. It's a contrived situation, but the contestants quickly begin to organize alliances, and then they begin to compete against other members. They build shelters, they share food with their own teammates, they punish individuals who they are seen as not putting in an effort for the group, and establish a hierarchy. This isn't too far away from what ancestral organization may have looked like. We'll take a look at how the evolutionary perspective applies to this concept of leadership. Now let's go to a little background about the actual research of leadership. I found a lot of information on this, so I had to pare it down somewhat, but there is evidence that leadership among human society is universal. But there's no unifying theory. It's been researched by biologists, economists, political scientists, corporate researchers, and recently attention has been given to using evolutionary psychology to help bring together those many perspectives. So how is a bunch of people hanging out connected to evolution and leadership? Well, thinking back on how selective pressure works, consider that living in a group is beneficial. There are a lot of species that have had selective pressures that lead toward formations of social groups. It allows for protecting resources, it can protect from predation. You can also share knowledge with members of your social group. This would also provide increased opportunities for successful reproduction. So there would be a lot of selective pressure here because of the protective factors of living with the social group, and that would help carry your genes further forward. How does that hierarchy itself form, though? So the hierarchy can form in a group due to a situation of a first mover or a dominant individual. This would be an example of the dominance hierarchy, where you would have the leader-follower relationship. The leadership role takes on decision-making, monitoring of effort, reward and punishment, and logistics coordination. The leadership role involves risk and can be more metabolically expensive, but because they are in the position they're in, they are likely to access rewards such as increased resources or increased access to mate choice. The follower role, on the other hand, also provides benefits because there's no extra risk incurred, and although they will likely not have that increased access to mate choice or resources, they avoid competition on the available food and mates that are there. Comparatively, this can be seen in many species. Whales, elephants, ants, fish, among others. The dominance-based leadership is frequently achieved through intimidation or coercive methods. The dominance hierarchy is not the only way leadership forms, however. There's a prestige model where leadership achieves its position through gaining respect of the group by displaying superior skills, success, or knowledge. Dominance tends to be claimed, whereas prestige is granted. So let's talk about that prestige and how it fits in. As mentioned, leadership can be observed in many species. This suggests leadership is a biological adaptation. This is how it would work. Early hominins were egalitarian hunter-gatherers that relied on cooperation to survive. Through modern hunter-gatherer societies, there are indications that mechanisms were developed that mitigated individual members exploiting the group. The adaptations in question are theory of mind and language. These two adaptations lead to the idea of reputation, gossip, and collective punishment. It becomes a cost-benefit analysis of selfishness versus cooperation. Now, these mechanisms would be applicable to all group members, but those within the group attempting to gain influence by providing solutions to collective problems the group may face would be under the highest scrutiny. If the individual is successful in solving collective group problems, that member would be granted the prestige from the group. Over the evolutionary scale of time, those who provide consistent problem solving for the group would likely gain a fitness benefit to themselves, ensuring genes are carried forward. But this would also apply to the group as well. This ties in with the idea of charismatic leadership. Charisma is a concept without a perfect definition, But Grabo et al. Referred to it as evolved fellowship mechanisms, factors of context, cues from potential leaders, and active signaling from potential leaders. Leadership potential is a concept that's not something you can see. There are many cues to what make a good leader. There is an interaction at play with the follower and the potential leader using the concept of the leadership index seen below here. It would break down like this. You would start with the external factors, such as war or peace, stability, or the need to change. The external factors would dictate the type of coordinated challenge the group would need to overcome. This leads to physical cues of leadership potential, such as height, attractiveness, facial appearance, more on physical cues later, and social cues like reputation or network size. The group would put in followership investment, and if the outcome to the challenge is successful, the leader will have increased reputation and prestige. Let's put this model through an example here. Let's use the high risk, high reward external factor like war. Followers in this situation may likely want to choose an individual who signals cues or abilities or a willingness to protect the group. A leader candidate in this scenario would likely have a high degree of masculinity. Although testosterone is not shown here, high levels of masculinity are correlated with increased levels of testosterone and therefore aggressiveness. And this would have that willingness to fight for the group and in turn inspire others to overcome the prestige challenge. Pictured here is President Zelensky of Ukraine. This is a pretty good example of a charismatic leader, as he had a popularity rating somewhere in the 30s before the war in Ukraine. And now, because of his charismatic style and people of his signaling and people wanting him as their leader, he is now has a 90% range for popularity. Now, trait theory is something that's a little different. This theory highlights the importance of being born with specific traits that increase one's chance of being a leader. Trait theory doesn't really consider the context of the environment, but the focus on the individual as having the necessary skills to become a leader. I personally feel this leaves out a lot of important aspects of leadership formation, but there is an extremely popular personality test that assesses leadership styles, temperament, and personality traits that corporations love to use on employees, and that's the Myers-Briggs test. I'm not saying that these traits don't play an important role, but I believe it goes deeper than just being born a natural born leader. And this brings us to the evolutionary contingency hypothesis. From here on out, I'll refer to it as the ECH for brevity. So this approach considers how to solve issues of group needs, such as food, security, conflict management, both in-group and between-group conflict, that is, finding foraging locations, managing infectious disease, things of that nature. Choosing a leader involves assessing the need for a leader, deciding who is best to lead given the situation, encouraging one to lead, and determining how effective that leader is after. Matching the demands of the environment and the needs of the followers, the evolutionary contingency hypothesis hypothesizes that leadership is context dependent. But how does the group decide on who is going to lead them? As it turns out, facial cues may play an important role for group deciding on a leader. Dominance is commonly inferred by faces. A dominant face is characterized by what are considered masculine features. So that would be like a strong jawline or pronounced eyebrows, eyes and lips that are thin. The dominant look has the effect of presenting what are considered leadership qualities to people. From an evolutionary point of view, these traits of perceived physical prowess may have been a reliable cue to solving dominance-related problems, such as conflict. But if you're looking for a trustworthy leader, the dominant's face may actually be a hindrance. The trustworthy face is considered more appropriate for environments that require peace and cooperation, according to the ECH. A trustworthy face is more adaptive to promoting that cooperation and avoiding conflict. These types of facial features are considered more feminine. They have rounder faces, larger eyes, fuller lips, small eyebrows. There was a study conducted by Little et al. In 2007 that looked at voting patterns, with results suggesting that people had a tendency to vote for feminine-looking leaders during times when making peace was a priority. And interestingly, there was another study conducted in 2012 by PSYC et al. That found that there was a preference over a masculine-looking female during wartime rather than a feminine-looking male. But what if you're looking for a competent leader? Your competent leaders tend to follow age. The older an individual, the more competent and leader-like that person will be perceived. Comparatively, in the animal world, age correlates with this idea of wisdom. Using an example of a study conducted by King et al. In 2009, they looked at the matriarchal elephant, and within that group, the matriarchal elephant appeared to have knowledge of where water resources would be located that the rest of the group either did not know or could not remember. And therefore, she was followed to it because the group knew that she was competent. Looking at this argument from the ECH makes age itself considered an important leadership cue in the domain of knowledge. Specifically, though, age is correlated positively with crystallized knowledge. Crystallized knowledge, for example, is that of knowing specific birth or death rituals in a group, or taboos within that group, or just traditions. But age is correlated negatively with fluid knowledge. And that's the type of the knowledge that would require new thinking, such as like locating new hunting grounds. In another experiment by PSYC et al. In 2014, people were asked to participate in a fictitious election for a leader. There were two scenarios. Scenario one was to vote for a leader during a time when stability was perceived as necessary. And scenario two was to vote for a leader when change was perceived as necessary. The participants were shown different faces, and as it turns out, consistent with the ECH, for stable times an older face was preferred, and during times of change, a younger face was the preference. And these results were consistent regardless of biological sex. Lastly, we're going to talk about attractiveness and what role it plays. And looking at it from the evolutionary perspective, attractiveness cues physical health of an individual. Thinking to ancestral times and the physical nature of the environment, choosing a healthy leader would be important for the often encountered physical tasks like group movement or relocation, hunting, etc. A modern day example would be the Nixon-Kennedy debate in 1960. So there was an experiment conducted by James Druckmann in 2003. He had people listen to or watch the debate. Radio listeners perceived that Nixon was the winner, whereas people who watched the televised debate picked Kennedy as the winner. Now, why would that be? A couple things happened during this debate. This was the first televised debate for a presidential race in history. So there were a lot of things happening. Lighting was something that wasn't experienced on camera before, certainly not by political candidates. Nixon was offered makeup to wear and he refused. Kennedy, on the other hand, he accepted wearing makeup. Nixon looked very, very pale and washed out and sickly. Kennedy, on the other hand, looked vibrant and healthy. Now, Nixon looked so bad, actually, it was reported that his mother actually called him and asked him if he was sick. So looking at the research, this came up once or twice, but it also got me thinking too. I was not surprised to find the idea behind the mismatch hypothesis. So during the EEA, the social organization was primarily hunter-gatherer style. Leadership roles were very context-based and really depended on what challenge the group had at the time and who was best suited to get the group through it. But also keep in mind that the challenges were based on physical needs, and as such, ancestral groups would pick leaders based on physical ability. Leadership roles could be fluid and change depending on the situation, partially because the group was small in organization, but also because the small groups would have had a high degree of kinship. There would be a collective benefit for leaders and followers, and it would allow for parties to propel genes forward very easily. We no longer live in the EEA. Leaders do not generally have to prove physical ability, but we still tend to assign leadership roles based on physical ability, leading to male leadership roles dominating modern society. even though there's evidence of females having better empathy and communication skills that are considered essential for the modern day global economy. So this brings us to our close. And in summary, I'd like to say this field is widely researched, but evolutionary psychology gives us that starting point. The starting point can tell us a lot about why we tend to pick leaders in a similar way to our early ancestors. But we no longer live in those times, and there may be a mismatch of needs in present day. And that brings us to our reference slide, which I would now like to read for you. No, I'm just kidding. I will do it through interpretive dance. I am also just kidding. But what I did want to discuss was a joke that was brought up in class a few weeks ago about what one lesbian would bring to a second date. And it was claimed that it would be a U-Haul truck. I would submit for evidence that that would be incorrect. Consider the demographic of lesbians, as chances are they are both working. There would be an elevated source of available income or resource, as you will. Because they would have this extra resource, there would probably be a lot more expendable cash. So therefore, I believe that on the second date, movers would actually be hired. Thank you for your time.